Great. Great. So one of the traditions of LinkPass is, one of the wonderful traditions of LinkPass is to have a keynote speaker from who is somebody who has contributed foundationally to linked data in the humanities. Well, quite seriously, I think if you look at linked data in the humanities at all, if you scratch the surface, you are in almost anywhere, you are quite likely to come across Rob. Rob is the semantic architect for the John Paul Getty Trust, which, as you may know, is comprised of 4 different programs: the Museum, the Research Institute, the Conservation Institute, and the Foundation. His role includes the design and the direction of semantic information systems across those programs, both at data and platform levels. Ongoing projects with Getty include improving linked data representation of the Getty vocabularies, transformation of the provenance index into linked open data, and publication of the museum's collection as both IIIF and LOD. He's a chair of the Web Annotation Working Group for W3C, specification editor and a leader in the IIIF community. He's on the advisory boards of the American Art Collaborative, Hypothesis, Annotating All Knowledge, and the linked open data for special collections. And previously, he's been the standards advocate at Stanford and was involved in the PCDM digital repository model and BibFrame ontology with the Library of Congress. I can say that without Rob's work, Pelagios would not have been possible, quite literally. So it's a huge pleasure and an honor to have Rob come and talk to us. When he speaks, we definitely listen, and I hope you will enjoy what he's got to say. Thank you, Rob.
So, thank you, Leif, for that introduction. So before I start, I want to call out something that Elton said. So who here has a degree or a degree in linked data? 1, 2. And who has a humanities degree? Yeah, so my PhD is in medieval French. So I think one of the great strengths of this community is that we are all imposters together. You know, we all come from a background, modulo perhaps 1 or 2, of history, of humanities, of looking at things with that mindset, but also the willingness to move forwards and do things in a linked and community-oriented way. So yeah, thank you very much, Leif, for the invitation to do the keynote and for the lovely, somewhat overblown introduction. I'm very excited to be here after my relatively recent move from Stanford to the Getty, which gives me an amazing opportunity to work on linked data and improve it for not just ourselves, but part of the community. So if you'll indulge me a moment at the beginning, I'd like to give a sort of meta-level header about the keynote. So in my experience, there are 3 types of keynotes. There is the CV, and this is not a CV, where I simply go through and list all the things that I've done. If you want to read my CV, go and read my CV. But don't. Actually come and talk to me, and I'm happy to talk about what I do. And it's also not a relatively dry scene-setting background domain summary, right? Maybe you hear something interesting, but maybe you've fallen asleep before I got there. So it's not that. Which leaves the 3rd type of keynote, which is the call to action. So I'm going to try and lay out some sort of vision, some ideas about where I think as a community we should be heading and ways to get there. And I'm not going to be coy and keep you in suspense as to what that call to action would be. It's to come together as a community to agree on how best to publish and create historical linked open data. And then, of course, we don't simply just do that and then disappear. We actually have to do something about it. And then do it. So the agenda, the summary for the presentation, pretty much follows that as a pattern, I'll start talking about community and how I see that as the foundational, fundamental aspect for linked data, as Leif and Elton were saying. Then about what might constitute best. What are the good practices that we can learn from and adopt about creating and publishing linked data. Okay, so first of all, in my experience in the technical specifications world, it's not the sort of self-appointed committees that produce successful specifications, it's communities that work together and have several key features. In particular, a focus, so we need direction and vision, and that needs to be articulated reasonably effectively by the leadership of the community to provide that direction so that we can all sort of march together on Washington rather than some of us marching on Washington and some of us marching on San Francisco, which is often less effective. It needs to be open at the same time. So just because there's a vision doesn't mean that this is some hierarchical top-down mandate. The requirement isn't reputation for participating, it's participation. If you're active, involved, and doing stuff, that's what we need. And we need to be open to enable people to be part of that, rather than saying, oh, we're a SIG and we've got these 10 people and that's all we need, and 3 years later we'll have a document that you can read, or not. So then it needs to be active, right? A community that isn't doing anything is just a list of names on a Google Doc somewhere. That's not really a community. And it needs to pay attention constantly to two things which are interlinked in my experience. Both the product, so where are we going, what are we trying to produce, but also the process in which that product is being created. How can we adapt as we go, and this is where flexibility comes in. How can we adapt as we're working to be as inclusive as possible? So a brief step aside, I'm also doubly grateful being a middle-aged white guy to be here giving the keynote. So one of the things that we tried to do is that while it was lovely to have the offer of my travel being paid for, the Getty is funding my travel, and we suggested that in order to increase diversity, the money that would have used to pay for my travel instead pay for other people's. So thank you, Leif, for being open to that suggestion. Okay, so flexibility. I like to think of communities being flexible rather than agile. So flexible, to me, implies some sort of strength. Like if you're a tree and there's a storm, you can sway in the storm. Right? You've got the other trees around you to support, but you move. You're not a cat that agilely jumps out of the way and avoids the problem. You move with it, but you remain true to your purpose. Okay, so focused, open, active, flexible. Sounds great, but how do we get there? So Catherine Skinner of Educopia introduced the community engagement pyramid to me, and it really resonated. So it has 5 levels, and starting with leaders at the top, then experts or advocates, contributors, members, and watchers. So there's fewer leaders than there are experts, there's fewer experts than there are contributors, and so on. To demonstrate this with AAAF, for example, there's probably 5, maybe 7 leaders who are actively out there in the community, constantly moving things forwards. There's maybe 10 to 20 experts who can answer any given question, sort of lead technical work or lead specification or community outreach. There's maybe 50 to 100 contributors who are actively participating either online or in person. There's 500 people, 600 now, on the AAAF discuss list, and more that are part of the community but not actively engaged. And then there's unknown numbers of watchers outside of the community looking in. So the point here isn't to say that there should be a hierarchical and fixed structure. It's that the people at each of those tiers need to be reaching down to the next tier to help people move up. So this sort of community leadership we've seen work very well in AAAF, and I think in other communities, also in the linked data space, that don't try to do something like this have had less success. So Catherine Bracey, another Catherine, gave a wonderful keynote at the Museum Computer Network in November around this topic. So I'm blatantly echoing her words, but I'm going to apply it to linked data. So the four sort of easy steps to note around how to build communities is step one, know your audience. Who am I talking to? Step two, meet on their terms, not on yours. Step three, have a conversation rather than just a presentation. And perhaps most importantly, create opportunities for meaningful participation. So I'll go through each of these in turn and make it a little bit more concrete, a little bit more related to what we do. And perhaps a little more controversial. So, who is the audience for linked open data? Researchers, right? No, I don't think so. Developers, to quote Bulmer. Or developers everywhere, to use the Toy Story meme. And I mean that literally, actually. Developers everywhere. Not just your developers, but developers everywhere who might want to use your data and can't necessarily come to your office and ask, oh, hey, I was using this Cydoc CRM thing that you told me about, and I was wanting to know why an E12 production is an activity, and an I've got it in my notes, E6 and usability. E6 destruction is only an event. Right? And actually, if someone can explain that to me, that would be great too. But yeah, they can't do that because they're not working with you. So, developers. So then, let's look at the community pyramid for linked data as opposed to in general. At the top, I think the leaders are the architects, the system designers, the ontologists, us, essentially. The people who build things for others to use. So then the second tier then are the content providers who use that, those ontologies and systems. They work with developers to build applications on top of that content. Users, and I think for our case, especially researchers, then use those applications. And of course, there's the watchers from outside, as with any community. Another thing to note is that individuals can fit into multiple tiers at the same time. And for the purposes of the pyramid, I think you should treat them as the highest tier in which they fit. So a researcher that can write Sparkle queries and a bit of code, you should think of them as a developer, not as a researcher. Right? So the audience for linked data, I think, is developers, because we can have them do the things with the data directly rather than researchers who can't. Right, so meet on their terms. So meet the developers on their terms. Don't go and talk about ontologies and reification and inference and triple stores and Sparkle and Turtle and because you lost them at ontologies, right? Talk to them instead about things in their world, so JSON and APIs and HTTP, that also are in our world. So remember, the developers are your gateway to your users, right? If someone can write a Sparkle query, they're a developer. That's maybe a little sleight of hand, but for the most part, it's your way to the users is through developers, which makes them necessary. So listen to them, understand what they need, and make them feel wanted and required because they are. So have a conversation, right? What does the developer need to be successful? How can you help them? Is the data understandable? Can they do what they want with it? How can the data be improved? And importantly, are their users satisfied? Right? It's through the developers that you're going to get to the users. And don't just talk at them, discuss with them, right? Create participation opportunities. So can your developers or the developers using your data provide feedback, right? Can they use annotation to annotate the data or the applications, the representation of it, to provide corrections? How can they get involved with your content? So not quite people looking at linked data. The screen's probably too small for you to see what they are looking at. It's actually a sound application. But I really loved the woman in the middle, her sort of extremely dubious expression. It's like, shouldn't that be an E89 propositional? Yeah, said no developer ever. I mean, that's what I normally hear. Can't you just give me some JSON? What is this stuff? Okay, so let's look at the workflow for how this all works. So we start off with the data being created. The knowledge is being represented as triples. So here we've got sort of pointy-haired boss cranking a machine that turns money going into something called triples that he doesn't really understand going out the other side. And in my experience, most management thinks of this really as a black box that costs a lot of money and hopefully something eventually is profitable. Those triples then go to a hardworking developer who has to turn it into an application that someone can use. The application is then used by the researcher and others to form hypotheses, do research, write papers, and so forth. So turning Turtle into HTML into a PDF, which from my former communications, scholarly communications hat on, that's not great, but that's the way it is. However, each of these individuals, each of these persona, have different expectations around the process. And I think this is the key point I'm trying to make. The first part, the ontologists, the data managers, the architects, us, they want the data to be complete, right? No data left behind. It should be a good, solid, thorough, complete knowledge representation of what we have. Right? We don't want to be losing stuff in the process. The developer, however, wants the data to be usable and understandable because that's what they need. That's their job. Take data and do something with it. And the researcher wants it to be accurate because any research they're doing is only as good as the data on which they're working. So if they can't trust that the content, the data is accurate, then their hypotheses are not going to be accurate. So then linked open data can be complete, usable, accurate, pick one. And pick usable. So here is my call to action, right? Pick usable. So unlike, it would be great to pick all three, right? But like good, cheap, fast, pick two as the sort of typical management approach. You can't do all things at once and expect to deliver anything in a reasonable time frame. It's a matter of limited resources and managing of priorities. So for today, I want to take accuracy off of the table. I'm not really going to discuss it beyond the call to say, let people help you fix it. Because I think it's really a function, a direct function of resources. And we're not going to solve humanities funding here today, unfortunately. So optimizing complete and usable. Is it possible to have both? Maybe, but pick one. Let me defend my position. So by trying to make data both complete, so a perfect knowledge representation, and usable, something that a developer can understand, we're trying to optimize two pretty much independent variables at the same time, and that's always tricky. Right, so are we prioritizing the needs of the data manager, or are we prioritizing the needs of the developer? In my experience, we tend to prioritize our own needs, being human, and that's the first. That's the completeness and not the usability side. And we tend to say, here you go, developer, this is what we've got, we've spent lots of money on it, it's really good, and that's it. We hope that they can do something with it, and then we get cross when it's not as good as we hoped. All right, so optimizing for completeness then fulfills the knowledge representation use case. But linked data, linked open data in particular, by definition, from Tim Berners-Lee, has a protocol aspect, right? It's RDF, following the standards, the 5 stars, I don't need to go through that, that is available via HTTP. So this protocol is a fundamental part of linked open data, and that's where this API comes in, right? So this bit. So it means that we're also implicitly designing and hopefully optimizing for a usable API at the same time as a hopefully complete knowledge representation. So this is where the axes of completeness and usability become more complicated, right? You can't have something that is 0% complete because then it would have nothing in it, so it couldn't be usable. But you can't also, I think, have something that's 100% complete and 100% usable. I have a graph in the next slide. So it's not really just, can I use the model to manage my data? It's, do I understand the model and can I use it to do something? So ontologies, I think, look a little, fit somewhere on this curve, right? So it starts off, if you've got 0% completeness, then you have 0% usability because you've got nothing, right? And then you start to add data, so you get some more usability. Then you get to that sweet spot and it goes way up for the usability. Then you've got the slippery slope as everyone, oh, hey, but we could add this new feature, we could add this other thing, we could add this thing, and all of a sudden you end up falling off the cliff at the other end. You've got something that's absolutely complete, but fundamentally unusable. Okay, so more potential controversy, because I know that you want to see where I think some specific ontologies fit on that curve. All right, so no tomatoes yet, good. So BibFrame 1.0 was a disaster, in my opinion. It was horrifically complex. It had all the usability problems and none of the completeness, right? So even worse than Simple Dublin Core. Simple Dublin Core is a bit better because it's at least more usable, but you kind of instantly run into that barrier of, oh, but I just need to say this next thing. Then you end up in the framework space, so the web annotations and the Europeana data model, they're good for what they do, so I think they're much higher up the usability, but not so far along on completeness. Then the AAA presentation API, I think arguably is as good usability-wise as maybe you can get, or at least as good as we've been able to get it. But it's still quite early in the completeness, right? There's a lot of things you can't say by design. Then schema.org, you're starting to add a whole bunch more predicates, a bunch more properties and classes, so it's starting to slip into the zone of, you can say what you want and it's still usable now, but who knows for the future. And then the ones that have fallen off the cliff at the other end is SiteUp CRM, which could be profiled to be useful, and then CRM Inf, which if you've looked at, then I'm sorry. So the target zone is in here, right? It's the top right-hand quadrant where you're maximizing the area under the graph for both usability and completeness. So yeah, the community then needs to take into account where on that slope you should be because that affects adoption. Right? If you're in a community that's mostly developers and people with less interest or skill in the linked open data and graph side, then maybe you want to trend more towards the beginning. If you've got a stronger community in the linked open data side, maybe you can add a few more things. But somewhere in that space. Right. So a brief diversion, but it's relevant, I promise. So for our wedding anniversary this year, my wife and I drove up to see the giant redwoods in Northern California. You can see some pictures. There's one you can drive your car through even. So these are 400-foot tall trees, that are thousands of years old. But there's still a forest that surrounds those trees, right? We went to see and use, I hope you're getting where I'm going, we went to use this tree, right? So you can drive literally through the tree, not even just up to it. You don't have to walk anywhere. This is America, after all. But without the forest that's supporting those trees, all of those trees would fall over. You can't have a single tree that is standing by itself in the middle of a plain that's 300 foot tall because the first storm is going to knock it over, right? So I'm not saying in this whole usability rant to get rid of everything else, right? You need to have supporting information to keep things useful and understandable, but you don't need to build a path to every single tree in the forest, right? You don't need to publish everything. You need to publish the stuff that's useful. So at the Getty, for example, in the vocabularies, I think we've gone far too much into publishing every single tree. So in the vocabularies, we keep a record of every single change that is made to every single resource. And we publish that as linked open data because someone might want to use it. Of course, no one does, and it makes the representation much more complex. So one of the things that we can fix. But how do we know what we should publish then? The other sages in the workflow have reasonably well understood methods of evaluating, should this be the way it is, right? You've got A/B testing, you can talk to users, there's unit tests, there's integration tests, acceptance tests, persona, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you evaluate an API? And because that's what we're doing, we're providing an API to our data. So I'd recommend Michael Barth's treatment of this. He lays out 6 fundamental features for evaluating APIs. So abstraction level first is the abstraction of the data, the API, appropriate to the audiences and the use cases that they want to use it for. So if you think about a car, the appropriate interface for the driver audience is push the button or turn the key to start it. But the appropriate audience or the appropriate API for a mechanic is much lower level, right? They need access to all of the engine and try to, if I tweak this, will it start faster or will it perform better, right? So keeping the abstraction level separate is important. Is it understandable? Is it comprehensible? Usable? Is it consistent? So are there special cases that people need to learn in order to use it? Or if you learn the first 50%, does the rest of it just sort of fall out naturally from what you've already learned? Is it discoverable and is it documented? Or how well is it documented? Does it correspond to the domain? So if you understand history, if you understand museum objects, if you understand activities, does the ontology describe it in a way that would fit with your understanding of what is trying to be described? And of course, are there few barriers to entry? So sometimes I hear linked data experts say, well, we should just use federated Sparkle. And yeah, I think Sparkle pretty much fails on all of those API criteria. I'll pick on consistency, explain that one, because it is, as an API, it's consistent, but it's really just a thin layer over top of the data model, and the data models are inconsistent. So for every single database that you're accessing via Sparkle, you still need to go in and write special custom queries, if not code, at which point your consistency between systems is very low. So that comes to that abstraction layer, right? Is the abstraction appropriate for the users? And my pitch is that Sparkle really doesn't have the right abstraction layer. It's the mechanics who need to get access to every single little bit of information that they possibly can, not the users who just want to turn the key and start their car. So yeah, when I hear people say just use federated Sparkle queries, my internal reaction is now you have more problems than you can count. Or You can tell that people are using your Sparkle endpoint because it's down. So here is the sort of Venn diagram of JSON versus Sparkle developers, where the JSON is in green and the Sparkle developers are in red. It's a little bit hard to see, especially on the screen, but I'll zoom in a little bit for you. Yeah, I mean, that's maybe a little bit complementary there, or uncomplimentary to Sparkle developers to say that there could be one Sparkle developer that doesn't understand JSON. The little red dot could be entirely within the green one. So by picking, Sparkle as opposed to simple REST and JSON, you're saying, I care about that little red dot and not about this huge mass of everyone else. Okay, so the little bit of background. What do we need to have available in the data? So the scope, in my view, is something like this. You need ontology and identity, and that needs to be able to describe historical activities. So that needs to have a type, an actor, a time, a place, what objects were acted on or with, and what the outcome of that activity was, what it caused. So I don't think that it's practical to discuss specific ontologies because that would end up in religious wars and we don't want them. So I think the things that we can practically discuss are things like serialization. And for that, I would urge you, so call to action, to use JSON LD. It is JSON, and hence you've picked the green usable large audience and not the small red dot, but with an explicit and managed structure. Right, the keys are named in a way that's useful for developers, not for ontologists. There's no hyphens, no numbers, no strange symbols everywhere, and so on. So I'm not sure if you can read it, maybe, but let me explain the distinction of the colors. So this is, I think, a good example of the usability that the JSON LD context gives us. So all of those blue strings are URIs. So man-made object, material are still URIs. They're just mapped to that from the URI structure that you would expect in the context that is referenced in that first URI. Also AAT, colon, blah, blah, blah. That's also a URI in a more typical sort of turtle prefix plus value. So the only actual strings in there are the red labels. So it means that the JSON developer can treat those strings as if they're strings, even though we know they're URIs. Right? So we're going to be consistent, and the developer's code can be consistent in looking for man-made object, because that's specified in the context. But they don't have to worry that actually man-made object is http signup.crm.org/E30 something. Anyway, man-made object, and I forget if it's man-made underscore object or man underscore, anyway, you get the point. Or more pithily, curly brackets are the new angle brackets, right? Everyone now uses JSON when we used to use XML. Okay, so then the challenges, and I'll count them down, my top 5 challenges for practical linked open data. So coming in at number 5 is order. And previously I would have put this a lot lower down, a lot harder. But particularly for this work, we're very fortunate that historical events are ordered by time. And Doctor Who time traveling aside, I hope we're not trying to represent that, that's consistent. It's globally true that something that occurred in 1500 occurred after 1440. So we can use those timestamps to have order inferred and used by the developers rather than using explicit ordering in the representation. But if we do need explicit ordering, then use RDF list. Right? It serializes nicely in JSON LD, it serializes nicely in Turtle, and Sparkle 1.1, not that I think we should care too much about Sparkle, but Sparkle 1.1 does have property chains, so it is then usable if ugly. Number 4, the boundary of representation. So what do I mean by that? It's when you dereference something, when you dereference some linked data, what do you get back? Where do you draw the line around in the graph of the triples in whatever serialization is returned to the user? So the critical point here, I think, is that we think of linked data as an API and not just a set of rules. Right? You can't have an API that follows a globally true set of rules and is still usable. Right? So we need to work with the developers who are using it to validate, is what we are providing in response to that URI useful. So here, this is exactly the same example, but with 2 lines highlighted. It is P2, has type, classified as AAT number, but it's made of AAT blah, 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 which is watercolor. Right? So the first one is by reference, and the second one is by some minimal value. And it was only in putting together the slides for this talk, because this is an example from some documentation that I wrote a month or 2 ago, that I realized that distinction, right? So why, we have to ask ourselves, why have we got 1 by reference and 1 by value? And I haven't validated it with anyone. I'm just as guilty as this is as anyone else. But that's an example of what we need to be doing and some of the effects if we don't. And JSON-LD, before I move on. JSON-LD has an algorithm called framing, which gives you this pretty much for free. You can say start here and then traverse the graph and build the tree, stop embedding at this point, but do embed this. One other thing that is interesting in this space is GraphQL, which is being produced by Facebook, that allows you to send essentially the framing in the query. So I want the response to have this shape, which could be useful in our world as well. Okay, number 3, metadata. How many levels of metadata do we try to squash into a single response? And at the moment, it's way too many. So RDF is really good about making statements about reality, and it's pretty terrible about making statements about statements, because you have to reify everything, and then it becomes difficult to understand. At 3 levels, it becomes terrible. And when you end up making statements about what you believe someone else used to believe based on the document that they wrote in 1400, that has been, stop. You have gone too far into the dream, or too many dream levels into the dream, and you need to get back to reality, right? Inception made an awesome movie, and it would make a terrible API. Right? Make broad statements about the data set. So say, it's got this license, we're this certain about this information, but don't try and say everything about everything individually, because you end up losing all of your usability. Naming things. Right? Plato has Socrates discuss the correctness of names in Cratylus. Is this the appropriate name for this particular thing? Which then led to the theory of forms. Maybe I should be talking to Elton, and nominalism and that sort of thing. My undergraduate work was in philosophy, and I have to bring it out at some point. Oh, and this is a picture from the Getty that we have, so another little bit of self-advertising. But yeah, we haven't solved it in the last 2,500 years, so like humanities funding, I don't think we're going to solve that today. But we do have the problem in several guises in linked data, right? It's the names of predicates. Are they understandable and usable? And in JSON-LD, are they mapped to something that is usable and understandable by the developers who are going to be consuming that? And hopefully across organizations. If 2 is naming things, then clearly 1 must be cache invalidation, which I actually do believe. It's not just a reference to the 3 hard problems of computer science. So efficient change management in any distributed system is a big challenge. We won't solve it without some layer of orchestration, because it really means having an API to predict the future. Right? When is someone going to change something so that I can go and fetch it and incorporate their changes into my data set? So the best that we can do is to have a lightweight notifications layer in the middle, perhaps using linked data notifications and WebSub that are being standardized in the W3C at the moment in the social web working group. And this would give us a distributed hosting pattern where you can have as many data sets around the outside as you want, as many notification systems in the middle as you want, particularly if they talk to each other. Then applications listen to those notifications and update their local caches of your linked data so that they have both fast access and up-to-date information. Yeah, okay. Oh. So number 0 off by 1 errors. So practical linked open data, and this is the home stretch, so thank you for your attention. PLOD, plod. I've got to say, Leaf, I'm not buying it. That's not the most awe-inspiring acronym I've heard. Mr. Plod, the police officer, is like, stop, don't do that. We should be looking to move forwards, learn and iterate, learn from our mistakes, not get sent to prison for not using the right predicate. So instead, we want U for usable. So my call to action then, fans, is to get loud, linked, open, usable data. And within the community, so cloud, community, linked, open, usable data. And it wouldn't be a linked data keynote without a backhanded reference to the linked open data cloud. Okay, so the community then includes everyone in that pyramid. And together, we can share the burdens of the 3 pick one things, right? So by linking to other people's data, we're reducing our own completeness burden. Not everyone has to have a complete description of Rembrandt or a complete description of Plato or the complete text of blah, 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 et cetera, right? By linking to people, we're sharing the completeness burden within the community. And by enabling feedback, perhaps with annotations or with other methodologies, we can reduce our accuracy burden by sharing it with the users and developers, right? If someone can say, hey, you've got this wrong, that's much more efficient because someone actually looked at and used the data, than having to go through every single triple and validate, is this actually a mirror of reality? Working with developers then also validates your usability. If they can build applications on top of the data, on top of the APIs, then you know that your data is usable. So who got this the first time round? So remember, FOF, not friend of a friend, but focused, open, active, flexible as the way of thinking about your communities. So then my suggestions to go over them in summary for the challenges of linked data are publish JSON LD, using lists for local order and time for global order. Use frames to describe the boundaries of your graphs and validate those frames with your developers so that you know that those representations are efficient and effective for what they're designed to do. Use understandable sort of developer-focused keys in the JSON rather than exactly what the ontology says. No one wants to remember all of those numbers. And alias URIs as well. No one wants to have to remember Pleiades 57034 or whatever it was is Athens if they can just use Athens or Pleiades : Athens. And you can validate that again with your developers. If they understand what's going on, you know that you've hit the sweet spot. You can publish notifications when you change things so that people can remain up to date. And yeah, so with that, I think we've hit everything apart from the off by one errors, and I'm afraid you're just going to have to solve those by yourself. So, thank you very much for your attention. So, I've taken an early New Year's resolution to never again say, I would now like to take questions, because that implies sort of you talking at me and then me talking back at you. So instead, if we have time, I would like to discuss. Right? Are there any comments? Is there any discussion that people would like to raise?
And with that, so is this microphone working? Can people hear? Is it? Oh, someone's got to the red button. Yeah, here we go. Hello, testing one.
There we go.
Excellent. Great, thank you, Rob. So yes, we will go to comments and discussions. I must say, it reminds me that I'm going to shut up, but I was reminded by your comment on timelines that when we did the Common Era's Temporal Gazetteer at Southampton, we started off with periods, Doctor Who periods, and that's probably why it was never a great success. So, okay, who has comments?
I wasn't controversial enough. There's no one.
I've got a comment in it, but I'm certainly happy to. Great, here we go. Pass that down.
Well, as a developer, going straight to the usability or practicability questions, JSON LD, very nice. How do I get it together with Sparkle, or is there something better than Sparkle to use?
Is the question, as a developer, should you produce JSON LD via Sparkle construct queries, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, as with development tools, how does it get together? Because, well, maybe I just haven't used enough JSON LD tools, but I have things doing JSON, and I have things doing Sparkle, but the things doing Sparkle usually do RDF and give me Turtle or what have you. And the things doing JSON usually do JSON. And how do I get them together?
Yeah, so it depends on the publishers of the content providing access to the data as JSON LD. So how they do that kind of doesn't matter. One way would be to use a Sparkle construct query to generate the graph and then put it through the framing algorithm as part of the serialization output. So if you have, GraphDB or something with reasonably customizable or flexible serializers where you can configure this is what it should look like, you could then have it push out that way. It's not that Sparkle is a bad tool, it's that it's a bad API. Right? It's not something, I think, that we should be saying, just use our Sparkle endpoint to other people wanting to build tools. If we want to use it internally to query the graph to do something because we understand the internal structure of the data, great, right? That's totally fine. But if you just want to have a MongoDB or React or simply files, JSON LD files sitting on disk served by Apache, that's fine too, right? Because you've already constructed your boundary of the graph for each representation so that you can cache it and have performance. So exactly how you get there is a local toolchain problem rather than something that we need to agree on, I think.
Okay, you mean, yeah, we have to start new thinking about the API and not just saying Sparkle is the API.
Right.
Okay, yeah, we get it.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to ask everyone, when you make a comment, also just introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Mariana, and I work here in Lean HD. I don't know how to say it in English. Anyway, I just like to comment your graph on usability and completeness, and I really didn't feel comfortable with the DC, simple DC to be not complete and not usable, because I think DC it's the only standard we have actually. When we talk about vocabularies. It's endorsed with ISO and all that. And I don't agree that it's not usable, because then we should introduce here the topic of interoperability, right?
Of course.
Yeah. So DC is very, very important when it comes to interoperability. And I think DC actually, I know that what I'm going to say, it's really controversial, but that's why we are here, right? Mm-hmm. To discuss and debate. I would put it on the area you said that it's what we aim to write. And I don't like to see schema.org there. I think schema.org, it's something in between, you know. It's not really a vocabulary for the linked open data. I don't see it like that. And they want to actually describe the world. So DC is very simple, but it's very interoperable. Schema.org, they want to embrace everything, so they lose a bit of semantic, or I don't know how to say it very well in English. So,
yeah. So
it's not a question; it's just a comment,
yep.
Right?
Comments are great. So the reason that I put simple Dublin core there is that in my experience, as soon as anyone sort of fills out their simple Dublin core 12, 14 fields, they then instantly run into, where do I put all of this other data, right? So then they either take description and cludge everything into description, which makes it not interoperable, or they leave it out, which makes it not complete. So it's low on the completeness because you can't say everything you want to in a semantic way, because you don't have enough fields, which makes it low on the usability because you can't then do anything because you shoved all your data into the few fields and now you've got a mess when you have to compare across systems. So yeah, that was the rationale for it. Discuss.
That's why we have application profiles, that you can use many vocabularies, okay? Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, my name is Kai. I'm from Mainz in Germany, more a user, so in the lower part of your pyramid. But somehow in your perspective seems biased by the work you have been done, from what I understood from the introduction. But maybe to put, no, please leave your yeah. Yep. What about a third axis and write communities on it? Because there are several communities. There are those that try, in the cultural heritage sector, that try to expose their information they have in their archives to, I don't know, whoever. But on the other hand, you have people who want to produce data during research and maybe want to use the data in their research, and they might have very different forms of this curve. So it's quite a three-dimensional thing. So what about the communities and community from your perspective?
Yeah, so as I said for that one, whereabouts best is on the curve really does depend on the community. that if you've got really good people who understand all of the sort of linked data technical details, then you can go further along without it becoming less usable, because usable is completely subjective, right? It's based on who is using it and whether they can do something. So if everyone is 100% behind Sparkle, say, sure, right, that's great. At the moment, that's not the case. Right. There's vastly more developers using simple approaches such as REST and JSON than federated distributed queries. So yeah, I agree that if you were to take a different, this is sort of the normalized curve from my perspective, and if you were to take a more specific, single community, they might have a very different curve. So yeah, if you were to project into 3D, it would look, I think, something similar, but yeah, it would have bumps in different places for sure.
Great, yep.
Hi, Richard Light from the UK. Well, the example of Dublin Core was interesting in relation to the Europeana data model, because my understanding of the Europeana data model is basically Dublin Core with a bit of ORE thrown in, and as such you might question whether it actually merits its much higher higher place on the curve. But this possibly raises a more general issue for our community, which when I was first looking at linked data, I called the DBpedia fallacy, which is that you can strip out from Wikipedia simple assertions and make them into linked data statements. And while you're dealing in a world where you've got subject, predicate, object, life is wonderful and first order predicate logic rules and all is well. But as soon as you say, you want to start to make assertions about the assertions, the meta problem, then life gets increasingly difficult. And the community here that's looking at cultural heritage basically does that for its living. We make assertions about assertions, and I think one thing we need to think about is the degree of complexity that we actually need, as well as, and your point about usability is valid, but at one level, usability means jettisoning all of our attempts at annotation and authority for data and uncertainty, all the things that we hold really dear.
Right.
So, challenge.
Yep, yes. And yeah, to clarify a little, it's not that we shouldn't do any level of reification, but we need to be really clear and dedicated in saying, is this something that we absolutely must have available in the structure of the data to query rather than perhaps as a free-form note, right? For example, in the provenance space for objects in museums, when the attribution of the artist to the object changes, right, that's an interesting fact, right? And throwing it away just because you want to update the production event, who the agent was that performed that activity, just because you want to update that doesn't mean that it isn't interesting that someone previously thought that this Van Gogh painting was actually painted by Rembrandt. Not that anyone would think that in particular, but or that the painting was previously thought to have been painted in 1400, but then more recent scholarship suggests 1500, right? So yeah, it's not that you can't go many, well, you shouldn't go many levels down in the dream, but yeah, looking down one level, there is times when it's important, but we need to really consciously decide to do it, and not just use a generic pattern a la RDF reification, but something like attribution as an activity. This person attributed this painting to this person at this time for this reason. If that's the sort of thing we're capturing, great. But let's keep that at the 1%, 5%, top end of the use case, because the 95% use is I want to know who really painted the painting, or when it was really done, or when we believe it was really painted. So.
Okay, we're going to finish there just because we're running a little bit over time. So let's first of all thank Rob once again. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.